By 2030, Uganda is projected to have the fastest-growing economy in the world, with an estimated growth rate of 7.48%. This prediction comes from the Harvard University Growth Lab's annual forecast report in 2022. Uganda, a small, landlocked country in Africa, once faced a horrific past under the notorious dictator Idi Amin. During his tyrannical rule, Amin transformed Uganda into what was essentially a living hell. The question is, how did this nation escape such depths and gradually become a global model? Located at the crossroads of East and Central Africa, Uganda holds a crucial strategic position. Beyond its low-lying plains, Uganda boasts remarkably favorable natural conditions. As an equatorial nation situated on the East African plateau, its average elevation ranges from 3,300 to 4,900 feet. This elevation moderates its climate, keeping it mild year-round rather than intensely hot. The soil is fertile, rainfall is abundant, and vegetation thrives. The country is also crisscrossed by rivers and dotted with lakes, earning it the moniker the Venice of the East African Plateau. This land is also rich in mineral resources, with over 50 types already identified. These include crucial energy resources like oil and natural gas, precious commodities like gold and gemstones, and strategic minerals such as copper and iron. Consequently, when the colonial era brought the British to Africa, Uganda quickly captured their attention. Winston Churchill famously called it the Pearl of Africa. To cement their control over Uganda, the British spared no expense, even building the Uganda Railway to rapidly extend their influence. After World War II, as the British Empire's power waned and the global wave of national independence movement surged, Britain was forced to abandon its ambition of maintaining its vast colonial territories and agreed to grant independence to its colonies. However, as an old-school colonial empire and a traditional European balancer of power, Britain still found ways to maintain influence over its former colonies even after their independence. Before relinquishing control, the British government, under the guise of helping colonies build democratic systems, strategically planted discord and propped up puppet regimes. Uganda, unfortunately, was no exception. Due to British machinations, after gaining independence, Uganda initially experienced good development thanks to its rich natural resources. However, it soon descended into fierce political infighting, leading to national instability and hindering its progress. After intense political struggles, Milton Obote, backed by the military, overcame all rivals, bringing a temporary halt to Uganda's political instability. Yet Obote's pro-Soviet leanings displeased the U.S. and Britain. Additionally, his nationalization efforts were overly aggressive and lacked proper transition process. Instead of improving, Uganda's economy worsened despite the newfound political stability. In 1971, while Obote was on a visit to Singapore, General Idi Amin, once Obote's protégé but later viewed with suspicion, launched a coup with British and American support. He overthrew Obote's government, which had become increasingly unpopular in Uganda. Ugandans hoped their lives would finally improve, but this coup marked the beginning of an even more brutal nightmare. Upon taking power, Amin established a brutal dictatorial regime. All who opposed him were physically eliminated. It's estimated that between 100,000 and 500,000 people were killed during Amin's rule, including prominent figures like Uganda's Chief Justice and the Anglican Archbishop. Even ordinary Ugandans who didn't oppose Amin faced immense hardship. While Amin, an extreme nationalist, likely harbored some desire to improve the lives of his people, As a warlord, he lacked the knowledge and ability to do so. Understanding the workings of a market economy, his proposed solution to improve Ugandans' lives was to confiscate foreign-owned businesses and have Ugandans operate them. However, with most educated Ugandans having fled in fear of Amin's persecution, the remaining Ugandans lacked the managerial skills to run these enterprises, which ultimately led to their bankruptcy. Seeing that business failures caused widespread unemployment, Amin resorted to printing money and distributing it to the populace. This only led to hyperinflation in Uganda, doing nothing to alleviate the economic crisis. In international affairs, Amin displayed an inexplicable arrogance, disregarding diplomatic rules and customs, which alienated many countries, especially Western nations. This caused a sharp decline in foreign aid, further exacerbating Uganda's domestic problems. Amin himself wasn't entirely oblivious to Uganda's internal and external woes. To ease tensions, in 1978, he invaded neighboring Tanzania, using Tanzania's sheltering of opposition figures as a pretext. He aimed to divert domestic attention and plunder resources from Tanzania to sustain Uganda. His idea was sound, but Amin picked the wrong opponent. Tanzania was one of the first African nations to establish diplomatic relations with China, and had provided significant support to China in international affairs. In return, China offered considerable assistance to Tanzania's development, including training its military. After initial setbacks, Tanzania regrouped and mobilized, quickly turning the tide. The Tanzanian forces not only recaptured their lost territory, but even pushed into Uganda's capital. Amin hastily fled into exile. The Amin opposition, which had been in exile in Tanzania, returned to power in Uganda. With Amin's chaotic rule gone, the situation in Uganda improved somewhat. However, the opposition was far from united. Alliance, having overthrown their common enemy, soon devolved into internal conflict, plunging Uganda back into chaos. The corruption, infighting, and inaction of the Ugandan government became intolerable for Defense Minister Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. Born in 1944, Museveni studied at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania between 1967 and 1970, where he was exposed to Marxism-Leninism and Mao Zedong thought, becoming deeply impressed by them. After graduating, he returned to Uganda, hoping to use his knowledge to serve his country, and secured an intelligence officer position in Obote's government. However, before Museveni could make his mark, Amin launched a military coup. Museveni, along with the president and many colleagues, was forced into exile in Tanzania. Because Museveni had organized guerrilla forces to help Mozambique fight Portuguese colonialists in his youth, he was considered a military expert within the exiled government. He was given significant responsibilities, becoming an important military leader in the anti-Amin coalition. The higher his position, the more clearly Museveni recognized the corruption and malfeasance of Obote's government. His approval of Obote's government steadily declined. Therefore, in the 1980 Ugandan presidential election, Museveni broke away from Obote's faction and formed the Uganda Patriotic Movement, attempting to run for president. Compared to other candidates, Museveni's base was too shallow, and with Obote's electoral fraud, Museveni predictably lost the election. Despite Museveni's defection before the election, as a key military leader in the anti-Amin coalition, Obote still appointed him Minister of Defense in the new government. Museveni served for a while, but saw the new government constantly preoccupied with suppressing political enemies and engaging in corruption, with no one genuinely concerned about national governance. Eventually, he lost patience and decided to emulate the Chinese Revolution, thoroughly overthrowing the old order to save Uganda's destiny. In 1981, Museveni resigned from his government position. With 40 like-minded comrades, he left the capital to the rural southern and southwestern regions, where he had the most supporters, and established the National Resistance Army, NRA. Before leaving the capital, Museveni specifically sought out the Xinhua news agency reporter in Uganda to borrow 5 English copies of Mao's selected works for the moral and ideological education of his troops. Educated in Mao Zedong thought, the NRA maintained strict discipline, never plundering the populace, and even provided practical assistance to the people. This contrasted sharply with the predatory behavior of the government army and other warlords, and the NRA quickly gained widespread popular support and rapidly grew in strength. Eventually, in 1986, they captured the Ugandan capital, achieving a revolutionary victory. Museveni was sworn in as president.
At this point, Museveni inherited a complete mess. Politically, while the national resistance movement led by Museveni had secured central power, various regional strongmen still held local influence, and the political situation remained chaotic. Economically, due to the inaction and mismanagement of successive governments, coupled with severe damage to infrastructure and economic sectors from the Civil War, Uganda's economic development had regressed to a point even worse than before independence. It was extremely poor and backward. Faced with these difficulties, Museveni did not back down. He simultaneously stabilized the political situation through a combination of democratic institution building and military action, while also trying every possible means to restore the economy. Initially, Museveni attempted to implement a state-controlled economic model, seeking economic development through self-reliance. However, Uganda's small size and poor economic foundation made a state-controlled economy unfeasible. A pragmatic leader, Museveni quickly changed his approach after hitting a wall. He began to accept the structural adjustment programs proposed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, absorbing loans to rebuild the economy. With international aid and capital investment, coupled with Uganda's abundant natural resources, a relatively stable political environment, and the Museveni government's focus on infrastructure development and talent training, Uganda's economy quickly began to recover. The Museveni government also did its best to mitigate the adverse effects of the aid-driven reforms from the IMF. Although the government had to agree to privatize state-owned enterprises to secure aid, it did not allow the process to run unchecked. Instead, it tried to influence the process as much as possible. For example, during the privatization of the Uganda Tea Growers Corporation, a semi-state-owned enterprise, the Museveni government distributed company shares to the actual tea farmers, allowing the public to share in the profits of the tea industry. To prevent monopolies, the Museveni government also stipulated that no single shareholder could hold more than 5% of the shares, while the government retained a final 1% stake to maintain influence over the company. Under the government's active guidance, Uganda did not fall under the control of foreign capital like many other aid recipient countries. Instead, these measures effectively promoted national unity in Uganda. Of course, these actions also led to some rent-seeking and corruption issues. However, Museveni had anticipated such problems and established anti-corruption oversight mechanisms early on, holding many corrupt officials accountable and effectively curbing such behavior. Through the unremitting efforts of the Museveni government, Uganda's economy continued to improve, achieving leading economic growth rates not only in Africa but also globally. Due to his consistently strong governance, Museveni has received strong support from the Ugandan people, repeatedly winning re-election and becoming one of Africa's longest-serving democratically elected presidents. This is a success for Museveni, but for Uganda, it's not entirely unproblematic. After all, Uganda's development has largely been driven by Museveni himself. With President Museveni now 80 years old, questions remain about how much longer he can lead Uganda and whether his successor will possess his capabilities and vision.